Shanghai in 1936, and journalists are swarming to the old Bund. Some in search of a beat that will make them famous, and others attracted to a never-ending adventure sponsored by colonial interests and political turmoil. The North China Daily News was the nexus for either, and in my Unreal 5 project, the next step here is to construct this building that was, by one 1937 journalist, described as a castle. You're tuned in to the second session of my series on unearthing the old Shanghai Bund. Previously, I covered almost a century of history leading up to the international settlement and its impending doom. North China Daily News journalist Ralph Shaw describes the 1930s period in his Sin City book as follows. The international settlement was in every respect a transplanted Fleet Street, the center of China's vast newspaper publishing industry, mecca of adventurous journalists from all over the world, the scene of a never-ending succession of turbulent events tailored immediately for front-page headlines. There was a full-scale war on Shanghai's doorstep. Death, doom, and disaster were omnipresent. Human suffering on a vast scale was visible in the city and far beyond. Murder, brutality, and cold-hearted inhumanity were part of the everyday scene. Gangsterism, piracies, prostitution, opium smoking, and many more ingredients of the violent era provided for us, the journalists of Shanghai. The excitement and the danger no Fleet Street man ever experienced. Or take Emily Hahn, world adventurer and writer for The New Yorker. She becomes the biographer for the legendary Sung sisters, probably the closest thing to royalty in post-imperial China. And in Shanghai, the closest thing to royalty, Sir Victor Sassoon, owner of the old Cathay Hotel here on the Bund, he had his own close friendship with Emily Hahn, a particular point of gossip and rumors among those abroad in Shanghai. Either way, her proximity to Sir Victor and his friends was an introduction to the real players in the international settlement's power hierarchy, and all the adventures that come with that. But when Hahn first arrived in Shanghai, she worked as a reporter for the North China Daily News. The book Shanghai Grand describes her time in China, where the International Council made it quite difficult for foreign women to work in the city. With the exception of vacationing, women were encouraged to stay away from this unstable environment for any long period, partly because, as described, the city could be dangerous, but also the last thing that British and American men wanted was to be bothered by family on a business venture where certain forms of entertainment were rather abundant. So, when Emily Hahn waltzed into the North China Daily News building looking for a job, she was told to go home, before then being hired on the spot. Miss Hahn's qualifications were impressive, more daring than half the reporters in the office. Her last big beat was the Congo, after all. How could Shanghai be any worse? Little did she know what was in store come the 40s. But in the meantime, Miss Hahn took on the new Shanghai beat, reporting on a variety of topics across crime, high lifestyle, and worker conditions. Though her most famous work would be a column for The New Yorker, issues sent back to the States, and for many Americans, her reports were their first introduction to the goings-on in China. So, it's in this environment, Emily Hahn's office, we begin the construction of building number 17, colloquially called the Old Lady of the Bund, a lone classical castle otherwise surrounded by old banks and Art Deco skyscrapers. And given its namesake, the Old Lady is fittingly of the classical tradition. Construction finished in 1924 and was designed by the firm Lester, Johnson and Morris. The facade could be traced back to some of the English classical precedents established by Christopher Wren in London, and probably John Nash's London work as well. You get the uniform and classical facade, which reminds me of Nash, but the dual cupolas, considerably ornate, recall Wren's St. Paul Cathedral. Design precedents still quite popular at the time, as sure, while Edwardian architecture was being phased out, architects were still influenced, especially Western architects working in the East. And following in their footsteps, we will also be so influenced. To begin any building from a classical tradition, such as the Old Lady here, design begins with the orders, this case Doric. See the channeled columns with the simpler bases and capitals? Not as simple as the Tuscan order, where the channels would be flattened out. To construct the Doric, architects then and now, we all use the old Italian Renaissance pattern books to pull proportions. Vignola's Canon of the 5 Orders is pretty easy to follow and usually the most common. Except wait, look at this. The column bases in Vignola don't match those of the old lady here. The pattern book, Doric, lacks a Scotia, which is the profile for the concave band at the center here, a detail more common among an Ionic base. Thing is, the Romans, whose constructions these Renaissance patterns are all based on, they had variations, and different Italian Renaissance architects will look to the different Roman interpretations for their own drawn standards. For the Americans, the Renaissance architect Vignola was the guy. William R. Ware, founder of America's first major architecture school, taught the Vignola tradition of classical architecture that later basically became the standard for Americans even a century later. However, for the Brits, they followed Palladio, another Italian Renaissance architect who standardized a set of rules and proportions for classical architecture, different in many ways from Vignola. And it is in the 4 books of architecture that Palladio's rules are set forth, including the more detailed Doric base with a Scotia. This takes us back to the history of the Bund being mostly a British development, and the architects, even way out in Shanghai, would be pulling from the English prevalence of Palladio. The tradition begins first with the base of a column. While the column will be a 3-dimensional sculpture, starting in 2 dimensions ensures that the proportions remain perfectly ordered. Palladio provided precise ratios that govern the Doric order's visual harmony. Thus, drawing a straight vertical line that is divided into 17 1/3 parts is the first goal. Easily accomplished by dividing a line into 17 parts, then adding an extra 1/3 part at the top, or you can array a straight line 18 times and cut 2/3 out of the 18th array. Generally, if I'm drawing columns in 2D, it's either by hand with drafting tools or in Rhino. The program is quite accurate in 2D, but any tool works. Following along in Blender with curves will basically give you the same results. Adobe Illustrator or vector drawing tools as well. Use those if you wish, and if you also know how to divide lines into portions in those tools, as dividing lines will be the most frequent technique coming up. Bottom part of the 17 1/3 stack becomes a module and is equal to the radius of the column or half its diameter, and that is the base. The height of a Doric base in Palladio is half the column's diameter. So, I hope you like ratios and divisions because that is what we're in for, a series of cuts on top of cuts. See here, the plinth is 1/3 the base. Easy enough. That is 1/3 M for module. But we've also got smaller cuts, or P as in parts, which a module contains 30 of. So, 1/3 of a module divided by half is 5 parts, and that is the division for the upper torus, which proportions a curve profile within the Doric base. 7 1/2 parts above the plinth is the lower torus, and between the upper and lower torus divisions, a segment reserved for the Scotia. These proportions all blocked out now give all the base height divisions. Width divisions are found first by dividing the column diameter into 6, then taking one of those 1/6s and placing it on both ends of the column diameter. In total, making the base 8/6 the diameter of the column. The 8/6 line is pulled up to the height of the plinth, and the plinth is done. All that work just to construct a square. But just wait, because now it's starting to get good. 3 3/4 parts in from the plinth edge is the center of a circle that, trimmed in half, becomes the profile of the lower torus. The cavetto space between the 2 torus parts is for the Scotia. I've always heard it referred to as a Scotia at least, but cavetto is the name listed in Palladio's book. That said, this division, that is 7 1/2 parts tall, should be divided into 6 segments, both the 1/6 and 5/6 lines carrying across. Bottom trimmed off into a fillet that connects with the lower torus. And the 5/6 division above gets a fillet as well. Its vertical extent, 5 parts in from the plinth and the lower torus edge. Before moving on to the Scotia, the construction lines used for drawing the lower torus can be erased as they're not needed. Between the 1/6 and the 5/6 lines, I place a dot that is 6 2/3 parts from the edge of the torus. Between the upper and bottom bounding lines of the Scotia, I draw a connecting line, divide into 3, and the 2/3 mark should be the height of the aforementioned dot. The dot can now be used as the quarter point of a circle, vertical line extending from the circle's 12 o'clock. So we got this perfect little circle here. With a quarter ellipse, it can then be linked up below. Makes the Scotia pretty useful in compositions. Just take a circle and scale it non-uniformly to fit whatever space you need. Trim up afterwards, and we're left with a curve that blends between two circular sizes. Above the Scotia, a small detail, fillet cut, that is about quarter of a part tall and quarter part deep. So then, last segment of the base. 3 1/3 parts from the edge of the plinth, we get the edge of another semicircle. But it needs to be constructed a bit oddly. First is a vertical line 1 part up from the top of the base module. Then 6 2/3 parts away from the plinth edge. A semicircle placed here to blend the base with the shaft. And that completes the base shaft fillet. Final step now is to connect the parts with a torus or semicircle. But a perfect semicircle won't fit, so we do what's called the Greek thumb. Quarter circle from edge of fillet down to a line that is 3 1/3 parts from the edge of the plinth. The lower gap left over, put in another quarter circle and scale it into an ellipse that resolves the gap. And that leaves a completed Palladian Doric base. Plinth at the bottom into a torus, Scotia, Greek thumb, and capped with a fillet. Naturally, base done, that means the next step is the column capital. However, something pretty goofy is afoot with the old lady here. And it's not this, the fact that the column capital is significantly smaller than the base. That's expected, called Entasis, where the diameter of the column diminishes as it climbs in height. Much like trees, which do the same thing with trunks and branches. Rational in terms of efficiency, right? More strength, more materials needed at the base to support what's above. Plus, cylinders optically feel wrong if the diameter is constant. The natural curve and perspective makes the shape feel too top-heavy without a taper. So millennia ago, ancient Greeks introduced entasis into columns. Great advancement in the arts, of course. Problem is, pilasters. The square profile extensions that come off walls and follow the same rules as a column. Entasis on these guys looks weird. It's really Wonka territory when you start to taper and warp verticals on straight pieces. And that is exactly what the architects of the old lady did. To which I have no words for other than whack. But the temptation to go full Willy Wonka has always been present with the classical rules. See, if we keep a pilaster straight as intended, then the upper capital is larger than the paired column capital and sticks out too far past carried beams. But then, if we correct for the capital and keep straight lines all the way down, then the pilaster is thinner. No good if you're implementing floor trims, because any patterns cut into the ground will no longer align with the base of the pilaster and column both. Generally, you want this alignment in floor trim compositions. So, what we're left with is 2 bad compromises and 1 horrific attempt at having it all. Unfortunately for us, the architects of the old lady chose the horrific option and Willy Wonka wins out. Back to Rhino, and I've got the blockout dimensions for the capital down. From the top of the first vertical line drawn, the 17 1/3 module's tall one, a module is constructed and divided into 3 parts: abacus, echinus, and necking. And the smaller divisions here, we'll get to those shortly. Then for the capital width, we know we've got the tapering of diameter from entasis. And that taper takes us from the base at an 8/6 diameter to a 5/8 diameter for the capital. The 5/8 proportion easily copied by just counting the blockout divisions from the base, 5 total. I draw that line and move it to the top of the column, being sure to keep that line on center with the base. Bottom of the necking and top of the abacus align with the top and bottom of the first horizontal guidelines here. The echinus in between is divided into 3 parts, with the 1/3 division providing the next horizontal. A vertical now placed down at the bottom of the necking, then carried up to that 1/3 division just drawn. This vertical should be in alignment of the 5/8 capital diameter. And after it's drawn, another line from the bottom of the echinus, or top of the necking, can be carried across. Between these two little parallels, a quarter circle can be used to construct a perfect square, since every quarter circle has the proportions of a square. Simply draw a vertical from where the quarter circle intersects the lower parallel. Now, beneath the upper 2/3 of the echinus, which is shown as the ovolo here, the lower third further divided into another 3 parts, the annulets. All 3 carried across between the previously constructed square. A 45-degree angled line crossing the square shows the divisions at which to evenly stair-step the annulets. Where the 45 crosses a horizontal here, those are the locations from which to draw verticals. The bottommost annulet also gets a special little kanji profile underneath, curved with a concave quarter circle for a nice shadow fall off when this thing is rendered. I trim up all the extra guidelines here and move up the capital. The 45 diagonal governing the annulets extends out to the top division of the ovolo. Where the echinus stops short of the abacus, another natural square is formed by drawing the intersection point down. Part of the magic of the proportions here is the fact that a half circle will perfectly fit in this vertical division. Center point at the abacus echinus division. Inside the big circle, a smaller circle with midpoint at the same location and height, but vertically it's proportioned between the top annulet and the top of the echinus. All I want here is the quarter circle to form the ovolo. So big circle is killed and the smaller circle trimmed down into a quarter. But big circle is brought back, though I draw it this time to the bottom of the kanji underneath the lowest annulet. Where the big circle intersects the echinus division, vertical line. That's the vertical of the capital abacus, sort of reminiscent of a graduation cap, and you'll see what I mean when this thing is visible in 3D. Cymatio, or cymatium in English, is the last step of the capital, a 4-piece tall division that drops in from the top of the column abacus. Bottom of this cymation is brought across, and in the new parallel we get here, the old quarter circle trick can be used here between the 2 lines, meaning of course that a perfect square is drawn in with a vertical placed at the quarter circle intersection. With this newly drawn square, the top line of it divided into 6 parts. Only the 1/6 and 5/6 division points here are relevant, providing the spots at which to draw an angled line. But first, need to carry across the 2/3 division of the cymation for a top fillet profile. The 1/6 point of the square is brought down to this new line, and the 5/6 division point is dumped down to the bottom of the square. Then, it's connect the dots on these 2 points with an angled line. Now is the time to cast some magic. A circle with its midpoint at the angled line's center and radius set to line's end, step 1. Step 2, an inversion, where an equal circle is placed with its midpoint at the angled line's end and the circle's end at the line's center. Step 3, process repeated and flipped at the other end of the line. And where the circles cross, midpoints for the construction of equal circles. The ancient flower of life has come into being, but isn't long for this world before we prune it down into an S-curve, the classic Cyma Reversa profile that caps the very top of the Palladian Doric. So anytime you see the classic Cyma Reversa or Cyma Recta profiles, which are pretty much used on every building or piece of furniture with a classical presence ever, there is a flower of life hidden in the profile's construction. After trimming and cleaning up construction lines is the capital's final step, construction of the Astragal. Simply a horizontal is extended out past the bottom of the necking to the end of the topmost annulet. Also, in relation to the annulets, a vertical guideline that matches the combined height is brought down past the base of the necking, and from the bottom of this vertical, another horizontal is drawn across. From the square that is now present here, it's converted to a semicircle with some trimming, then capped with another square fillet profile beneath. This wraps up the composition, truly capital. Rookie mistake here would be to then just connect the capital and base together. But recall the entasis, a smooth tapering of the column's diameter. which also isn't consistent. The entasis begins 1/3 up the height of the column, and can be drawn from that division to the capital by drawing two verticals, one from the capital's astragal end and another from the base. They will of course not connect, but be parallel. One of these lines can be divided into 10, and each division of 10 make a horizontal between the parallels. Bottommost horizontal, then divided into 10 itself. Each of the points should be moved up in height to match a horizontal line via a terrace sequence, one at a time, so that there is a constant stair-stepping of these points top to bottom. With these divisions in place, they become the control points for a splined curve, and that splined curve is the naturalistic line of entasis for the column. At its top, where it joins the astragal, another small kanji is placed. Concave quarter circle to transition between the rectilineal fillet and the column shaft's edge. This is the completed Doric column from the instructions of Palladio. Everything needed in 2D to construct the column in 3D space, which to make means the 2D should be exported as an SVG file that Blender or a 3D modeling tool can read as curves. Though, before jumping into Blender for modeling, I want to quickly construct a small diagram to help model the shaft's channels. The Greeks of antiquity decorated their columns with cuts running vertically in a radial array, possibly a design element that made reference to wood columns. Stripping a tree of bark to make into a column leaves all sorts of cut marks that are reminiscent of the channels here. Then, with the Roman variants that the Renaissance artists like Palladio studied, you get more consistent cut profiles. Ionics and Corinthians with fluting, and the Doric with channels. These cuts we'll handle after the 2D column here is made in 3D, but first drawing some diagrams here in 2D will answer a couple questions as to how these channels are handled. So, I take a circle set to the column's diameter on plan, then draw in 20 equal pie cuts. Then, the pie cut intersections along the circle's circumference can be brought down in the front view as verticals. And once again, we get a little bit of the Vignola and Palladio difference here. As with what I'm used to, I defaulted to 20 cuts, which is closer to Vignola. To do this right in the Palladian manner, it would be around 24 channels instead. Ultimately, this distinction doesn't matter too much yet, but will when this thing is brought into Blender, and I'll switch to 24 channels then. What's important now is the channel profile. Circle is drawn with center at one of the channel intersections and radius set to its neighbor. Same thing again, but for opposite side. Now, the two circles together form what's called a Vesica Piscis, like the fish sign, or a Venn diagram. And at the bottommost intersection between the Vesica here, one more circle is placed that is the same size as the other two circles. The intersection of all three circles is a perfect equilateral triangle with bulging arches, which is the profile we want after trimming away the excess circles. Top arc of this profile here, then polar arrayed around the column diagram for an accurate view of the drawing and plan. In fact, this diagram is showing two views at once. The column in top view, then the column in side view where the verticals of the channels are brought down. Subsequently, I need this side view drawing as well to resolve the bottom of the channels, which is a similar profile to the channel cuts, but a bit different. First, fit a circle in between the center channel. Bottom apex of this circle is the new midpoint for an even larger circle that intersects the channel verticals where they meet the halfway point of the first circle. The arc that's a bit flatter is the wanted profile here. After, it's flipped upside down. With that, these diagrams should be sent over to Blender as SVG files to accompany the column drawing. In Blender, these diagrams and the columns, they're all read as curves given the SVG file import. But before they can be made 3D, all the horizontals should be deleted except for those of the abacus and the plinth. Recall, those are the top and bottom rectilinear pieces. Ways to clean up the curves here too. Delete the unused curve points, merge the curves together, the usual. When the curves are cleaned up and combined, they're converted into a mesh, where it is necessary that the mesh pivot should be placed at the column's center point for the next step to work right, spinning the magic pottery wheel, otherwise known as the screw modifier. That 2D drawing is now a 3D column. At least it is after the correct axis is chosen, which will depend on how the drawing was imported and if its transforms were applied or frozen. By default, the column will look considerably faceted until you go to town on the amount of steps. Between 48 to 64 tend to be good numbers here. For the abacus and the plinth, those pieces are rectilinear, thus making the magic pottery wheel useless here. But another tool can be used, the angle tool, a great plugin from the Blender market. It allows a 2D profile to be spun around an axis as well, but instead of a rotary form, the angle tool generates corners, and with one 90-degree corner down, symmetry modifiers quickly finish off the form. Now, this may be good enough in some cases, just the column with no channel cuts. The Romans introduced this variant as an acceptable option, and it was also prevalent in the Renaissance. But the old lady in Shanghai, her columns, quite channeled. So, that channel profile from the Vesica Piscis, it is vertically extruded. Then, the second channel profile drawn from the two circles, it is perpendicular to the first channel profile and placed at the bottom of the vertical channel. An easy way to make these 3D is to use another Blender Market add-on, Curves Mesh, which constructs a soft surface between two curves, meaning all there is to do here is to loft between the Vesica profile, which faces up, and the circle profile that faces forward. Some cleanup may be required at the end here, but it is just merging of vertices that intersect poorly, nothing crazy. This small piece can be merged with either the top or the bottom of the channel and mirrored vertically to cover the opposite side in Z, the result of which will be converted into a sort of reverse mold that can subtract away from the column. But of course, given that the column has the entasis, the vertical channel here also needs a warping to follow the curve's surface. Eyeballing alignment here is good enough, with edge loops added into the channel that can then be aligned to the column's entasis. After, the channel should be made into a mold, which is just a matter of making it a solid by extruding it out, then adding a radial array applied around the column. This is where the number of channel cuts and their size matters. 24 channels seem to match up with the reference columns. Then, because the Blender radial array is a modifier stack, the size of the channel can be modified in real time to get the general size right. Soft scaling with a falloff helps get the top part of the channel correctly positioned in respect to the entasis. Generally, this step tends to be a bit of trial and error, going back and forth between modifying the mesh and then seeing how it works with the radial array. The channels shouldn't be intersecting, but at the same time, gaps between are no good because gaps between channels makes them flutes and therefore better suited to an Ionic or a Corinthian column. The Doric, though, no gaps. The channels butt right up against each other. When these inverse mold channels seem to be matching the column well, that means it's time for the cut. The column receives a Boolean modifier set to difference and a solver of exact. The cutting object should be the radially arrayed channel molds. And upon application of the modifier, the column now has voided out channels cut in. By the accounts of Palladio, the column is complete, save for a decorative flourish placed upon the necking. cgtextures.com offers a good selection of ornaments for download, of which many work for our purposes here. Some cleanup, smoothing, and backface removal is all that's necessary to prepare the ornament for the necking. And the cylindrical curve of the necking, that can be resolved with the Blender Project to Surface add-on, which matches a 3D object made straight on to a curved surface. Radial array modifier then copies the warped ornament to the column's cardinal directions. While still in Blender, the aforementioned angle tool can also be used on the 2D drawing of the column profiles to create the building's pilasters, in the same manner that the abacus and plinth were constructed, giving a pilaster that matches the finished column. Now comes the weathering and sculpting of the column to achieve a look that isn't entirely razor sharp. Blender and Rhino can create the exact, mechanical, precise column, but of course, reality doesn't always allow such perfection. Therefore, Zbrush adds the organic element of stone sculpting and weather-inflicted wear. For the sake of easily showing the process, I split the base off the column here, but it's not necessary to do the columns in segments unless desired. Dynameshing the piece up to 1,000,000 points rebuilds the topology and unifies the mesh into something that can be sculpted upon, and for my purposes, use of the clay polish feature. Clicking the clay polish button a few times softens out all the harsh edges of the geometry without warping the shape too much. In the Deformation tab, pumping the Polish Deformer also helps to smooth out any stubborn, harsh surfaces. Edge chipping along any of the corners further adds some realism, implying that these columns had worn over time, achievable with the Trim Dynamic brush. Little thought to be had here, turn off your brain and go to town on the object. Though if taken too far, the column will either look ruined or as if it belongs in Fantasyland. Best to stop just short of the feeling that the edge chipping is too much. Surface noise is even easier via a classic method courtesy of the Gnomon Workshop. First, store a morph target. Then, in the Surfaces section, procedural noise can be enabled. Noise plugin button opens up numerous random noise options, but only the erosion checkbox is of any importance here. 3 sliders are now available: strength, noise scale, and plugin scale. Pulling these up and down for a bit should yield good results. When satisfied, simply click Apply to Mesh. Now, the surface noise may be too much across the whole object, which is why the morph target was stored. The morph target brush brings back the stored mesh wherever the morph brush sculpts into the surface noise. So a good balance of noise and no noise can then be achieved by hand. Column is now ready to be sent back to Blender, which will be difficult given the 1,000,000 point count. But no worries, because the Decimation Master plugin can drop that significantly. First, pre-process current, and after Zbrush takes a moment to complete the request, setting decimation percentage down to something like 5% will keep a good level of detail, but drop the triangle count all the way down to something like 50k. A try count easily imported back into Blender for UVing. And frankly, the UVs don't matter that much, as the goal will be to use projected textures in Unreal. But some sort of a basic UV is needed for texture masks. A seam can be drawn down one of the channel edges just by masking connected edges all the way up and down the base here. The topmost faces just receive a camera projection from top view, after which the UV interface has a Seams from Islands button that will return marks on the model in 3D space, leaving a nice automatic marking along the top of the base. A similar technique can be done on the plinth, but with a cube projection. Just be sure that all the faces of the plinth are selected for this to work right, as basically, the cube projection is just returning orthographic UV shells for these chunks. After Seams from Islands on the plinth projection returns marks into 3D view, the shaft can then be selected with a double click and subsequently unwrapped with the Unwrap Conformer solver. If that unwrap is too warped, the unwrap with minimal stretch may return a better result. But with that, all the pieces should be unwrapped, and selecting the UV button to match island scales will make the UV shells consistent enough for whatever packing method you use to get UV shells into 0 to 1 space. I use the UV Packmaster add-on, but Blender default is just fine here. Even though an Unreal shader will be handling the application of textures to this object, Substance Painter generates the masks that will allow Unreal to properly apply weathering effects. First, utility masks should be baked in the Substance Painter Baker. Then, given that the goal is to have a single RGB texture for the masks here, the first fill layer is straight black, then full red, green, and blue. All three set to the linear dodge blend mode so that they add together instead of lerp. Smart masks from any source applied to these layers should suffice here, though I am partial to the JR masks from ArtStation. The guy does a great job at building smart masks that can be dropped onto layers with very little additional work. Generally, I do green first and apply a mask that adds values into the cavities. Here, I believe it is the JR cavity mask. Blue as edges, and a JR edge dirt mask works well here with a bit of adjustments on the levels side to hit a higher level of contrast between edge and surface. Red is more versatile, handling a combination of surface wear, leaks, and ground dirt kick-up, meaning that red can be duplicated a couple times and assigned to different areas of the column. The shaft piece and capital get JR drip masks, and the base gets a red fill with a ground dirt mask. Underneath position gradient in the mask controls, the balance dictates the height at which dirt is kicked up onto the base. Column mask done, the final image can be exported to safekeeping for later use, when it's time to set up materials in Unreal. The artifact of the Doric Column, understood now to be under the Palladian method, in the same manner as the classical architects who built up much of London. Despite the different tools, digital drafting in lieu of hand drafting, 3D modeling instead of stone carving, the proportions and design methods remain consistent with those employed over a century ago by the designers of the Old Lady of the Bund. And in the next session, the true power of columns as a proportioning device will be seen through the development of the building's facade. And of course, along the way, expect more stories from the 1930s journalists who worked here. Thanks for watching, and hope you can catch the next one.